working with survivors of conversion practices. And I'm just quickly going to do an overview of that. I am not going to go into detail here. So if we look at this, Outright developed this toolkit in conjunction with PsySSA, and it is for mental health providers working with survivors of conversion practices in Africa. It provides mental health providers with a flexible and responsive framework to support survivors of conversion practices while maintaining ethical and emotionally grounded care. This grounded is in affirmative practices and trauma-informed care. It is designed to be adaptable to each survivor's unique journey, and it recognizes that healing is deeply personal and non-linear. So our toolkit was divided into two parts. Guidelines 1 to 14 focuses on supporting survivors of conversion practices, while Guideline 15 and 16 are tailored for mental health providers. And each section stands alone, and providers are encouraged to begin wherever they feel most useful, based on their client's needs, their own context, and their stage of learning. So this toolkit is a resource designed to equip practitioners with knowledge, frameworks, and tools to provide affirming, trauma-informed care. This toolkit is grounded in cultural, historical, and systemic realities of the African context. It bridges the gap between theory and practice, and it empowers providers to support survivors of conversion practices in ways that are sensitive, effective, and ethical. So the key objects was to equip mental health providers with the contextual knowledge needed to offer culturally responsive, affirming care in African settings, deepen understanding of survivors' experiences, needs, and recovery pathways to guide survivor-centered interventions, offer adaptable tools and guidelines that addresses survivors' uniqueness while supporting providers maintaining their own well-being. Because we also need to understand that when we work in this field, we do experience trauma as well, that kind of secondary traumatization. And it introduced evidence-based frameworks, including affirmative practice and trauma-informed care to create a safe, ethical, therapeutic environment. I'm not going to go today really into our journey. We don't have time for that. But maybe we must just stand still for a moment at what is a conversion practice. Well, conversion practice referred to a range of harmful practices, often disguised as treatment or therapy or spiritual guidance, that attempt to suppress, change, or deny a person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. These practices can be subtle or extreme, but all carry the message that LGBTQIA+ identities are wrong and in need of fixing. Now, many say, but are people really experiencing conversion practices? And is this really still real in this day and age? It definitely is. And I think especially if you work in sexually and gender diverse spaces with clients, because we have macro conversion practices, for example, exorcism or kind of spiritual healing practices, but we also have micro conversion practices that we still see quite often creeping into these spaces where we engage. We know that every major health and mental health body across the world has denounced these practices. We know there's credible evidence that they do not work. and no credible evidence that they work at all. And there's a clear mounting evidence that they cause significant and lasting harm. And especially what we see with our survivors of this type of conversion practices is that a lot of them present with PTSD symptoms. So I'm quickly going to run through the guidelines and see if we at least have a minute or two at the end for any questions. So guideline one is creating a safe and affirming environment. Guideline 2 looks at the rebuilding of trust in the therapeutic relationship. Now, a lot of our survivors had a trusting relationship with the person that did the conversion practices or therapy. And for us then, as counselors and as therapists, it becomes very important to be aware of that trust relationship that was ultimately broken and the trauma that been experienced within that relationship, and must make very sure that the relationship that we now build up with our clients is safe and there is trust. And don't push that kind of trust. That is built over time. Guideline 3 is about navigating trauma, emotional regulation. We know that most of the people that come out of these spaces are very traumatized, and there's a lot of triggers that's still embedded in the experience, and they can be emotionally overwhelmed. And what is nice in this toolkit is that we provide you with exercises where you can explore, for example, expanding your window of tolerance, or identifying triggers and coping strategies, and that is in a worksheet. Or how do I work with trauma narrative building and expanding the process in that. Guideline 4 looks at healing from loss, shame, and regret, finding hope and meaning. So we see a lot of our survivors quite often participated in conversion practices because they wanted to fit in, or they wanted to be the so-called normal, the heteronormativity that we are so aware that's part of our cultures. And for them, there could be a lot of shame. There can also be the loss of community that they found there, let's say, in their church setting, cultural settings. And there could even be regret that they participated in it. And how do we find then again hope in meaning as we move forward? Then also reclaiming one's own identity and affirming this identity. Because a lot of survivors feel disconnected from their authentic selves. And for us, it becomes then very important to address this internalized stigma and the rejection that is there, and also for survivors that they can rebuild their self-esteem. A next guideline is then building resilience and strength. We have a resilience celebration checklist there. We look at when was I resilient and when was I not resilient, as well as we look at personal strengths that's already there in the gender and trans client. We look at establishing boundaries and safety in relationships. So not only do we look originally at boundaries and safety within our own practice, but also how can I, as a survivor of conversion practices, look at establishing boundaries with other people? How do I look at creating safety in reality in our relationships? And even if I work with other people, um, how do I set up boundaries between myself, let's say, as a survivor of conversion practice, and other fellow survivors of conversion practices, and make sure that there's not that kind of trauma bonding that happens? If we look at guideline 8, we see there that it is managing of crisis situation and emotional distress. How do I navigate crisis situations and when I become overly emotionally triggered? And you will also find in the toolkit some wonderful tools to deal with that. Guideline 9 is reconnecting with significant others. Quite unfortunately, it could be the family that participated in these conversion practices or introduced the client conversion practice. So if there's, for example, a parent that really cannot fathom their child being trans, they might introduce them to a therapist, a counselor, the pastor, the imam, to help them to convert to becoming cisgender, which we know is not possible. And how do I then, at a later stage, walk a path with my client if they want to reconnect to their family of origin or culture spaces? Also, how do I support my client with spiritual, religious, and cultural reconciliation as they move forward in this space of healing? It might be a spiritual life map worksheet that we need to create. It might be towards self-forgiveness, also in a spiritual sense, and also reflecting on harmful relationships that did exist in these conversion spaces. Guideline 11 is about exploring intimacy, romance, and sexual well-being. How can I reconnect with pleasure and intimacy? How can I become more aware of my body? Because we know a lot of trans people disconnect from their body. And with conversion practice, it becomes even a further disconnection. And how can I reconnect, or maybe connect for the first time with my body and live in a space of self-care also towards my body? Guideline 12 looks at navigating complex family dynamics. How do I work with my family? And how do I also find support and possible reconnection there? Guideline 13 look at engaging safely in digital spaces and building online connections. We know that a lot of harm is happening also online currently. And how do we deal with this? So let's say there is disinformation or misinformation on the internet, or even positive information, affirming information coming through, but you go down and you see how people mistreat our trans person and the kind of ways that they would comment on these sections. How do we deal with that? And how can we help our clients to navigate these spaces? Guideline 15 then looks at power and privilege in the therapeutic relationship. And I think this is very important for us as well. When we look at as counselors and therapists, how do we navigate our own power and privilege that we have? And are we really aware of this? And then guideline 16 looks at self-care for the mental health group. Space survivors of conversion practices, we need to also be witnessing these stories and listening to them, and becomes for us then very, very important to also do self-care. As said by Weingarten, that we need the traumas that's there, but we also need to be inward in order to deal and help our clients to deal with these diverse traumas. And this is, in short, the toolkit for working clients in these spaces. So we have 5 minutes for any questions, if anybody of you have questions. Otherwise, we're going to move back into our joint room.
I just wanted to say thank you for
Is there any questions?